Hello and welcome. My name is Quincy Lissauer. I am the Executive Director of ssafe, and together with Professor John Spink, we have developed a short tutorial on food fraud and how to use the ssafe food fraud vulnerability assessment tool. This free open source tutorial has been developed in partnership by ssafe and MSU to help companies that want to use the food fraud vulnerability assessment tool. We are going to give you a quick background around food fraud, what it is, and what its impact is, after which we will give you a background on how the tool was actually developed, some case studies on companies that have used the tool, and an idea as to what the benefits of the tool are for you as you are potentially applying it to your business. So John, it would be great if you can give us a quick introduction to what food fraud prevention is.
Thank you, Quincy. First off, ssafe has been a great partner for us, working on a lot of areas in food fraud prevention research, and this tool is a great product to give a real overview and really get started and give some structure to the assessment. So I'm Dr. John Spink. I'm director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University. Our research focuses on policy and strategy, so it's really perfect for us to sit here to do this introduction of food fraud prevention. First off, we need to step back and look at the definitions. You cannot believe how important it is to step back and have a glossary of terms to discuss the definition and scope, because we've experienced quite a bit of confusion and some false starts on some projects when people have not looked clearly at the definitions. So broadly and really generally considered, the definition of food fraud is an act of illegal deception for economic gain using food. And the key is this is all types of fraud. A lot of times there's a focus mainly only on adulterant substance or on counterfeiting or stolen goods or tampering, but really for the enterprise, being a company or a country, to protect themselves, really needs to look at all types of fraud. This broad definition is consistent with Global Food Safety Initiative, European Commission, the United Kingdom, ISO, China, and others. The key is that economically motivated adulteration, or EMA, is a subcategory of food fraud. If you're dealing with FDA, then you should use FDA's definition, and FDA has been clear that their working definition is a substance for economic gain. A key for food fraud is that the purpose is economic gain. We need to look deeper at why and how people find a fraud opportunity. That's one reason that this vulnerability assessment tool is very helpful, because we look at a lot of different aspects of your product as a target. It's important to state that food defense, whether it's defined by US FDA, GFSI, or others, is separate from food fraud. It's a different concept because the motivation is traditionally harm or terror. Now, there's a lot of examples of food fraud that we won't go in here, but the key is that the effect is always a public health threat, or it's always an economic threat, not always a public health threat. It is always a public health vulnerability. And when we're looking at root causes, that's really important for us. So originally with the food fraud think tank for GFSI, there were 4 of us originally on that group, and then 6. It was really important to step back and define what is food fraud and what is not food fraud. Now, there's often a lot of overlap, but what you'll see is that half of these are unintentional, so you don't try to create a food quality or food safety incident, and the other half are intentional. From the unintentional side, you can look at those; they're accidental, and a food safety incident does lead to a foodborne illness. And on the intentional side, from food defense, it's an ideologically motivated act for harm that could be economic, public health, or just general terror. And for food fraud, the goal is economic gain for themselves. When we're looking at crime science and criminology theory and the motivation, the root cause, it's really critical to look at these core fundamental drivers. So food fraud, defined by GFSI and then really more broadly accepted by others, has a wide range of types of incidents. So you'll see this starburst here of, substitution could be extra virgin olive oil with regular olive oil. Concealment could be blending various types of olive oil. Mislabeling, so changing the expiry date. This could also be country of origin, could be even the weights. Gray market product theft, diversion, and overrun. So this is sale of excessive or unreported products. This is an area that's very challenging for traditional food science or food authenticity programs, food quality programs, because these are happening outside the supply chain. These are a lot of times more a focus of a group such as corporate security or other types of investigations. But a key is these can lead to a brand on a shelf being somehow fraudulent and illegal. So what GFSI did is step back and look at the broad scope of food fraud and put all these types together for us to look at one time. Next. Unimproved enhancements could be adding colorings to olive oil. Counterfeiting. So this is intellectual property rights, trademark, logo. It could be copies of the popular brands. This is another area that's outside the traditional focus or countermeasures of a lot of food quality assurance groups, because a lot of times the quality assurance is looking at supplier quality assurance, product coming in, or controlling the product in manufacturing. Once it's shipped, it's often outside the scope or control of those groups. But again, looking at food fraud for an entire enterprise, this is a really important topic. Finally, dilution. Olive oil with diluted, potentially toxic tea tree oil. Now you'll see that in the top, those three are really what we see traditionally as food authenticity or food adulteration, but really for food fraud, we've got this entire scope. Next, the focus is really overall on protect, what we're trying to do in this whole prevention concept. First is brands. Brands are key. Brands are what consumers look for, and that really adds value to the entire product line. Company finances. Companies are financial entities judged on financial metrics. It's important that we focus on this as a part of the protect area. Customers. So customers are the people that are buying the products. This could be a business buying from another business. It could be that end customer, but it's the process of actually purchasing that product. Consumers. This is getting to be the ultimate goal for us. Consumer confidence in the consumers themselves, the people that are actually receiving that product, consuming it, and to maintain their high level of trust. Finally, drive food trust. This is the goal. If we accomplish this, then our consumers and all the parties in the supply chain, including governments, have a really robust system that has that high level of trust, and then we all truly succeed. Thank you, Quincy.
Thank you, John, and thanks for giving us that background on food fraud prevention. As we said, this tutorial is also to try and help companies determine how the food fraud vulnerability assessment tool was developed and how it actually works. So over the next series of slides, we're going to show you why the tool was developed, how certain companies have applied it, and what the benefits are. If we go back into the history, as GFSI came up with its requirements for food fraud, as well as regulatory requirements from the FDA, Sarbanes-Oxley, and others, ssafe saw that there was a real need to help companies determine how to undertake a food fraud vulnerability assessment tool. As a nonprofit organization, it is part of ssafe's mission to help strengthen food supply around the world. And by the development of this particular tool, we actually meet part of our mission. So ultimately, ssafe partnered with Wageningen University and the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam to develop an initial version of this tool. We then consulted on it with industry experts and further refined it through extensive external consultation before launching it in partnership with PwC in 3 different formats. Going back to why it is that we developed this, and John, I will refer back to you again on this one, as you were part of the original food fraud think tank that GFSI had set up. GFSI has basically come up with 2 requirements. For an organization to undertake a vulnerability assessment and subsequently prepare mitigation plans. John, how did the food fraud think tank come up with these 2 requirements?
Yeah, it's a really important point. So originally we looked at and were tasked to look at, what is food fraud and then how to address it. And a lot of the food fraud research is not new in and of itself. It's really based on other standard practices such as ISO 31000 risk management, decision making, basic total quality management. And so really the thing you have to do first is conduct an assessment of the entire system. And so by defining food fraud as all types of fraud, it's looking at this assessment of all types of fraud. And then once you've done that assessment, you can prioritize and identify from those vulnerabilities that you identify, which of those vulnerabilities are actually risks, which of those are actually hazards, and then which of those are hazards that you need to control. So what GFSI did is lay out some very basic requirements, and a couple key points are noted in here. One is that the standard shall require that the organization have this plan. That's not just a site-specific assessment. This is looking at an entire organization. So a site could refer to a corporate plan as at least a starting point. And the next for both of these is documented. It must be documented so you can show someone that you've done it. That helps with the sharing of best practices and refining the process. And the first one is this vulnerability assessment for food fraud. There's no more details. These are very short requirements from GFSI. The key is they want the process to start. From the mitigation plan, it's just identifying from the vulnerability assessment which of those problems are the most severe that really need a control plan. Also, if you think about things the way like HACCP is managed in your company, there's work processes around how you meet, what you do to take new actions. So you start with those basic concepts. The final point that GFSI emphasized is that it must cover the relevant GFSI scope, and it must be supported and integrated into the food safety management system. This is not a standalone type of assessment that just is out there. It really does need to be worked into the entire overall food safety system. Thank you, Quincy.
Thank you, John. With that requirement then in place, ssafe looked at how it is that it could potentially help the food industry develop a tool that helps do the vulnerability assessment. And working with Wageningen University, we came up with a relatively simple 3-step process. By looking at whether there is an opportunity for fraud to be committed, the motivation for somebody to commit fraud, set off against the controls that a company has in place within their organization, you get a very good view as to what your vulnerability is as an organization to fraudulent activity being committed against your product, your brand, your organization. The way that the tool works is it has at the front end a decision tree to help you determine where to target the tool at. It then goes through a series of 50 questions that then provide a series of spider webs for rapid analysis and to prepare a mitigation plan. The tool can be applied to any type of food business, irrespective of where they are along the food supply chain, the size of the company, or where they are located in the world. It can be applied to an ingredient, a product, a brand, a site, a country, or the entire company. That kind of flexibility is what is one of the big benefits of this particular tool. As you noted in the requirement from GFSI, it doesn't tell you whether or not you need to apply it to an ingredient or a site or a country or to the entire company. It leaves that flexible to you depending on the risk level of fraud based on your organization. So what we have developed here is a tool that can be applied to any of these particular components, whether it is an ingredient, a brand, a site, a product, or an entire company. As I mentioned already, the tool works through a series of 50 questions around motivations, opportunities, and controls, providing general and detailed spider webs that allow for rapid interpretation and analysis. It then identifies areas of vulnerability. It also provides external links to other sources of information and tools to help you both answer the question and potentially help you develop some mitigation techniques. It's a structured assessment that can be done on a regular basis. And again, John, maybe you can say a few words on this as well, but it's very important that organizations do an analysis like this on a regular basis rather than just as a one-off, because we're really working with a moving target here. Isn't that correct, John?
Yeah, Quincy, that's really important. Now, the first time we look at this, it is a static review. We're looking at current sets of information because you're doing this for the first time. So it's important to gather as many vulnerabilities as you can think of and then research them a bit. So you do want to record those. Now, remember, every vulnerability is not a risk, and every risk is not a hazard, and every hazard is not a hazard that requires a control plan. You want to identify those vulnerabilities. Then the next time you review this on whatever cycle you decide is efficient, then you have this list to start from. An example is that for 1 year, species swapping of horse and beef might not have been an issue. But if all of a sudden a year later you're starting to review it, you may see some incidents happen. In that case, maybe then you did identify horse meat and beef sooner, and maybe you put some control plans in place. So it's important to look at how soon and how often you do review the incidents, and then how often you update the vulnerability assessment. Now consider this: once you've done it once, you've got a process. It's going to be easier the second time. Once you've used the tool once, then it's going to be easier the second time as well. Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks, John. And then ultimately, the tool provides a report that can form part of your food safety management system. So for those who are going to get audited by an independent third-party certification body, providing services against the GFSI requirements, you can basically take the report and include it with all your other food safety management system activities. What the tool does not do is help provide mitigation techniques. Here we have an example from the early 1900s where Coca-Cola was offering $500 rewards to be able to catch people selling fake Coca-Cola. That is one particular mitigation technique, but there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different ways in which to potentially mitigate against the vulnerabilities that you identify. So the tool, unfortunately, does not include any recommendations for mitigation. However, it does provide sources and references to areas of information that could provide mitigation techniques. Next, I'm going to provide you with 3 different case studies from 3 different companies across the food supply chain. Royal Ahold, or Ahold USA, who have a number of different supermarkets across the US, was a project partner of ssafe from the start of the development of the actual tool. They tested it during its development phase in October 2014 on their honey supply, their own brand honey supply in the US and in Brazil. The assessment results aligned with a previous deep dive that they did already on that honey supply before. So it helped us to determine that actually the tool worked because it gave them very similar, if not the same results as one that they had already done previously. The main benefits that the tool provided them with is that it helped them identify which questions to ask their suppliers as well as part of their supplier management activities. And secondly, it also helped them with the speed with which they could do a vulnerability assessment. Their deep dive took quite a long time, whereas the usage of the ssafe tool was very quick. They were able to do it in a matter of 90 minutes rather than a matter of days or weeks. The second example I'm going to give you is one of ssafe's members, Kerry Foods. Also during the development of the actual tool, looked at applying it across their organization. What they did is they looked externally at the GFSI position statement and volunteered to participate in the ssafe project. And internally, they created a food fraud governance team back in Q4 of 2014. They then piloted the tool with ssafe, and internally, they prioritized the raw material categories that they wanted to apply the tool to, and did awareness and training of the ssafe tool internally. Next, they expanded the Kerry food fraud policy, while internally they did a vulnerability assessment by project team as well as with the internal subject matter experts. Subsequently, they validated externally the results from the vulnerability assessment tool with peers, customers, and external subject matter experts, while internally consolidating those results and undertaking a governance review. Finally, they did some peer validation and refinement with the market, while deploying the vulnerability assessment tool across the entire organization. Now, Kerry, when they applied this, looked at raw material categories. Going back to something that John mentioned earlier, it is very important to realize and recognize that you don't necessarily need to apply this tool at an ingredient level or at a product level or at the entire company. You need to apply this where it makes most sense for your particular organization. Now, a company like Kerry with thousands and thousands of different ingredients, for them to effectively deploy this by analyzing it at an ingredient level would not be very effective. So what Kerry chose to do is to look at this from a raw material category perspective, prioritize in accordance with their horizon scanning and their own internal risk assessments that they'd already conducted. They then reviewed it with Kerry supply quality team members and subject matter experts, reviewed it with cross-functional experts across the business, and ultimately also reviewed it with peers, partners, and third parties. Now, the balance that Kerry ultimately is looking for is to use the tool across all 50 raw material categories that it has, across with 100% reviewed by Kerry's supply quality team, 50% by cross-functional experts, and 25% with external partners, peers, and third parties. So where Kerry ultimately wants to get to is analyze all 50 of their raw material categories, have those reviewed 100% by all of their supply quality team and subject matter experts, 50% reviewed by functional experts, cross-functional experts within Kerry, and 25% of it reviewed by peers, partners, and external third parties. That is how Kerry has applied it to their business. That is how it made most sense to them. And it has been very effective in helping them identify potential areas of fraud and to close specific gaps within their organization. The third example is a very small liquor business based out of Colombia. The reason why we chose that is we wanted to look at a small business and see how they could potentially apply it within their organization. So the company called Puro Colombia has a turnover of $4 million and approximately 50 employees. They only have two products, a national drink of Colombia called aguardiente and rum. Their markets are mainly in the US with a little bit of export to the US, Canada, and China. Their supplier base is pretty much local in terms of local ingredients. They've got very few suppliers, and the only component of their product that comes in from outside of Colombia is the packaging that they import from China. These are the actual spider webs that came out of their analysis when they applied the food fraud vulnerability assessment tool. And what you can see here very quickly is where there are red spikes, that they know that those are areas that they need to ultimately focus on in terms of mitigating against any vulnerabilities. And the green spikes, those are areas where they're pretty strong in terms of controls that they have in place. So what did they ultimately do after their analysis? Well, they looked at and they investigated methods for improving the company's traceability system. They prepared a code of ethics and guidelines for all employees. They developed a whistleblowing system. They also reviewed all their future contracts with suppliers to include additional requirements to help strengthen both food safety and fraud controls. They requested their suppliers, their key suppliers, to complete the food fraud vulnerability assessment as well. And finally, they prepared fraud contingency plans, a business continuity plan, and provided managers with crisis management training. Now, one of the important things to note here is that some of these things go well beyond protecting and strengthening the company's food safety activities beyond just food fraud. And this is where you can see one of the other advantages of the actual tool, is that some of the weaknesses that Puro Colombia found were also going to help them strengthen not only protecting them from a food fraud vulnerabilities component aspect, but also beyond that, help them strengthen the business as a whole. The tool now has been used for about 24 months. We've had over 12,000 downloads of the Excel version of the tool, and over 3,500 online assessments have been completed as well in over 80 countries. So what we can conclude from that is that the tool has been very beneficial to many different companies across the food supply chain, across the world, and it is being used very broadly. The Food Fraud Vulnerability Assessment Tool is a great place to start assessing your vulnerabilities to food fraud. It is tailor-made to help companies meet the GFSI requirements. It identifies vulnerabilities, enables mitigation, but does not provide mitigation techniques. It's applicable to any type of food business across the food supply chain. The tool is free to use in Excel, online, and as an app, and is available in 10 different languages. So I would conclude that it's a very practical tool that is relatively easy to use, that is free of charge, and is a great place to start assessing where you might be vulnerable to food fraud and start preparing mitigation plans. John, have you got any final words you would like to say?
Sure, Quincy, thank you. I think a real key is just get started. That this is a new area, it's a new topic. It's criminology, it's supply chain, it's a lot of different topics. But the key is that there's resources like the documentation with this tool and the tool itself. So just starting to work on it. This is just a first step. It's not going to be the final step. We're getting from point A to point B. Eventually, we'll get all the way to point Z. But we need to go through point B to get there. So that's a real key. There's a lot of resources out there, and just really happy to be a part of helping this get out to the marketplace. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, from a SAFE's perspective, we're really pleased to be able to work with MSU both on this tutorial, as well as continuing to work together over the long run to strengthen the entire food industry's ability to combat food fraud. In addition, we have developed a separate recording to actually provide a live demonstration of how the Food Fraud Vulnerability Assessment Tool works in its Excel format. So for those who are interested, together with on the same page where you were able to find this particular recording, you're also able to find a live demonstration of the actual tool. John, and to all the audience, thank you very much.